Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. My name is Miriam Hewitt. I'm Assistant Director at the Center for Public Service, and this is part of the CPS Speaker Series. Today's talk is entitled Considering the Social Construction of Race in Community Engaged Research by Dr. Caryn Bell. And I'd like to introduce Dr. Bell. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Social, Behavioral, and Population Sciences at Tulane School of Public Health and Tropical Medicine. She's also the CPS Scholar in Residence. Dr. Bell's research focuses on the unique impacts of socioeconomic status and place on cardiovascular disease, risk factors in Black Americans, and racial disparities. Her work explores the nuanced ways in which socioeconomic status is associated with obesity and related behaviors in Black women and men by examining the role of place and sociocultural factors. She uses varied techniques, including spatial statistics and mapping approaches. She also examines how place shapes structural racism in the US and the implications for Black health and racial health inequities. She teaches courses on health equity, racism and health, as well as place and Black health in the US. Prior to joining the faculty at Tulane, she was an assistant professor of African American Studies at the University of Maryland, College Park. She received her PhD in Social and Behavioral Sciences at the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health and a BS in Chemistry from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. It's my pleasure to introduce and pass it on to Dr. Bell.
Good morning, everyone. That BS in chemistry kind of got me. It was a long time ago, but thank you for that introduction, Miriam. I want to say thank you to you specifically for shepherding me through this position as a scholar in residence and really listening to a lot of my rants, which have been funneled into this presentation. So I appreciate that. I appreciate the position of being a scholar in residence at CPS and all of the work that you all do. And I really appreciate all of you all for coming. This is an important topic, but I think that we talk about it a little too narrowly. And most of the beginning of my career was trying to figure out why we still had racial health inequities among college-educated Black and white individuals. And it took me too long to understand that the reason is racism. And it took me too long to figure out that we're going to spend a lot of time trying to document racism, trying to measure it. And that time could have been used or can be used to address and dismantle the inequitable systems and racist systems. So this work or this talk sort of comes from that. The talk is titled Considering Race as a Social Construct in Community Engaged Research. That title is a little sanitized. I didn't want my actual sentiments to be published on the flyer or published in the email, but I used them to organize my thoughts. A better title for me would have been this quote: "So you believe race is a social construct? Okay, great, but now what?" So I think that we spend, like I just said, spend most of our time or too much of our time arguing our existence, particularly as Black scholars and Black researchers, trying to say we have these racial inequities because of racism, because race is socially constructed, and we spend a lot of energy trying to prove that when we could have been, and excuse me, let me make sure I'm clear. I'm not saying that we shouldn't do that, but more of our time and energy should be spent in making sure or using that energy to address the inequities, to dismantle the racist systems, to actually improve, in my case, over here in the School of Public Health, to improve the health of Black people. So that would sort of be the title, or at least my first sentiment about it. And we'll go through all of these things that you see on the screen below that first potential title that I decided not to task Miriam with having to put on a flyer. I also will give two examples of the use of racialization and the social construct of race in community engaged work. One example is involving the US Census or changes to the US Census, potential changes to the US Census. We'll see if they actually happen. And some of my work, which is on Black entrepreneurs and their health. The second potential title that was probably a bit too racy for an official title is summed up in this sentiment or in this quote: race is a social construct, yes, but I'm still Black though. So this considers expanding our conversation of the social construction of race beyond simply what it is, but its implications. And that can include how individuals and groups identify their ethnicity and how race can inform, for some people, not everybody, but for some people, can inform their ethnicity and their ethnic identity. And because of that, when we sort of diminish our conversation to simply saying that race is a social construct and all of the variations of that simplistic statement, we can actually participate in erasure. And my overall sort of argument or thing that I want to press is that if you are not able to have this expansive understanding of race as a social construction in all of the ways that it impacts people, you might not be able to do community engaged research to the degree that it should be done. And so I'm going to talk about this concept of culture in community engaged research and how positionality, even epistemology and ontology can come into doing effective community engaged research. But if you don't feel that you're able to do that, or if you're not equipped to do that, and this applies to everybody, including myself, there are some spaces where I know that I'm not able to do that, then you should not be doing this type of work. But if you are able to do that, actually create a spectrum of community engaged research with regard to race, there are levels at which you can participate if you're willing to engage in the topics in across the spectrum. So that was a lot to introduce this talk, but I will start from the beginning because I do want us to be grounded in what community engaged research is and what it isn't. So there are multiple types of community engaged research. You will, if you have been involved in community engaged research or have been exposed to it, you will understand that there are degrees to which the community is engaged, for example, is one way to put it. In the field of public health, the model that we are most commonly using is CBPR, community-based participatory research, and that centers on co-learning and shared power. The talk that I gave last semester for CPS talks about co-learning, specifically that the communities that experience the harm actually have the solutions already in them. They already know what the solution is. So the co-learning is really about not just empowering those solutions, but either moving aside or coming alongside to promote those solutions. But that's one example of community engaged research. Another example is participatory action research. This comes from a long interdisciplinary history, both in the US and the global South. But that research is based on the need for action and centers active participation for those who need the action. So I like to explain participatory action research as in we have a problem, we are going to take the actions that are necessary to solve the problem, and the research is involved in that. But essentially, you can describe it as including applied research, action learning, and development. And then lastly, one that I want to point out that does not get as much shine is citizen science, and that's basically how we employ data to serve and empower people. There are lots of examples of citizen science, but it's becoming more popular. The one that I like to talk about in class is databases around policing and more markedly police shootings and killings, and how those can be used for citizen science. But overall, in terms of community engaged research, what the goal is, it should be toward equity and justice, but often that is not the case. Oftentimes we see community engaged research simply being employed to make sure that a funding requirement is met, being employed because a academic or someone who is in academia might not know some of the ins and outs of the community, so they will seek to engage the community. But the true goal of community engaged research should be towards equity and justice for the people that you are working with as an academic. Okay, so here we're going to talk about what race is. I would argue that for almost all community engaged research, you have to be able to understand race and racism. That is critical, that if you do not understand it, you're not going to be able to do it effectively. More importantly, you might be doing community engaged research that is actually harmful. I use this definition of racism by Zambrana and Williams because it is, or these two researchers or scholars are pretty prominent in the public health world, and the paper's from 2022. So I'm trying to use something that is the most or more recent. They describe racism as an organized social system in which a dominant racial group uses its power to devalue, disempower, and differentially allocate value societal resources and opportunities to maintain power. So there are different types of racism. When I'm teaching about racism, I like to use the racism umbrella, where we start off with systemic racism, and that's sort of all of the types of racism. And that definition, which I don't have here, but that definition speaks to how racism works to create and maintain power, societal power within the quote unquote dominant group, or the group that has the most power, and it shapes and shifts in order to maintain that power. Then there are also different types of racism: structural, institutional, cultural, interpersonal, and internalized racism. And I want to make the point that all the types of racism can be understood individually and together as working toward that goal of racism that we see in this definition. And I would argue that community engaged research related to race, which almost all of it is, should seek to fight against the harmful effects of racism and or dismantle the systems of racism. So I just wanted to give that definition or understanding of racism first. It's not simply interpersonal or personally mediated racism. It's a whole system that shapes our society. But the topic of this presentation is on race, not necessarily racism. Race is a social construct that basically means that it's not based in biology. We made it up. We continue to make it up. It changes over time and place. There are other social constructs that we deal with: gender, money. I like to use adulthood when I'm talking with students. How do you define, or how do you know that you're an adult? The variations are eye-opening. I often wonder sometimes, am I an adult? I'm not sure. But what we do with social constructs is what matters here. So we're going to do a participatory activity that shout out to the Partners for Advancing Health Equity, which is a program or project that I'm involved in, has introduced me to this tool called Menti or Mentimeter. What you can do is go to menti.com on your phone or on your laptop or your computer, whatever you're using, and then type in this code 97114694, and you'll be able to see this question. Now, this question is kind of rudimentary, right? How would you describe race to an alien? I thought about, like, you could say, how would you describe race to a child? But children as young as 3 already have some conceptualization of racial differences. And I thought about maybe asking the question in the form of, how would you describe race to somebody from another country, but racialization is global? So I said, how would you describe it to an alien? Sorry if it seems kind of goofy, but that's what I came up with. So you can go to that website. I'm going to pull up the screen right now. So I'm going to stop sharing this presentation. And I'm going to share, okay, results are coming up, awesome. I'm going to share my screen with the Menti, okay. Yes, I'm assuming you all can see that. Okay, so you can type in your response. How would you explain race to an alien? I put down here, it's a friendly alien who just wants to know how things work around here. So you can type in your response, how would you explain race? And since this might take a little bit of thinking, I'll sit here and let you all think about it. And I'll even participate as well. Okay, I think I can show the responses so far. See what happens. Okay, cool. This is working. Awesome. Okay, that was one thing to make sure that it works. Okay. Here we have some responses. It's a way for me to tell who is less than me and who is superior to me based on how I look. Interesting how you personalize that response. That's very interesting. Social categorization of people based on culture and what they look like, also very interesting. A way for society, what society has categorized people to assert and maintain power over some. The way we've made up to categorize people based on skin color. Yes, it is something that was created a long time ago to put people into categories in hopes to understand differences, but has been used to sometimes put others down. People in power who at the time were very pale decided to organize social status on a spectrum, darkness to paleness, with paleness being the most desirable. Okay, very interesting. They're also incorporating cultural racism, artificial way for humans to use to separate people based on physical appearance, set of ideas that allows us to differentiate groups of folks. Typically, I'm literally reading these out loud because it's a way of learning what other people think, but also can help you understand what you think a bit more. So sorry if it feels weird that I'm reading them out loud. A set of ideas that allows us to differentiate groups of people, typically by observable features, and then different societies can and often do value these groups very differently. An arbitrary system of categories based on either skin color, geographic origin, language, or origin, ethnicity, or culture, and that functions to maintain certain groups in power. A way to organize people to maintain power among the richest. Race is not found in our genetic makeup. It's a social construct where other humans use phenotypes to classify others. Racial labeling creates hierarchy in our society. The social meanings that we attach to groups based on perceived biological differences. Race is the different colors, hair types, and eye shapes you see. Race is a concept that is used to make up differences between people. Okay, I wanted to read them all out loud to honor everyone's contribution and to make sure that you are hearing what other people think about this topic. So I'm going to stop sharing again and then go back to my slides. Okay, so the definition that I included was the one where we have created these categories to maintain power among the richest. So race is a way to socially sort people, but the goal of race is to maintain power among a select group. And that is in the US, the wealthiest white people, often white men. So it's all about maintaining power in the one group. In the US, race is rooted in anti-Blackness as well. And so people sort themselves and put themselves in groups to distance themselves from Blackness often and get closer to whiteness. But we'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, so just a quick description of how race is used in public health. again, because I'm situated in the School of Public Health, and that's what my research is in. Understandings of race are often used to explain racial differences in health. So past uses often were rooted in racial essentialism. That's the concept that, or it's actually two things, where race is biological, but also that you only look at, or this concept of monolithic experiences or identities, or how you put people in one bucket based on their race. So not looking at differences within racial groups, but literally essentializing it, saying that what we see for one person or one community with regard to their race is the same for everybody with that same racial identity. But also in public health, we have pathologized race, specifically pathologized Blackness and Black culture. And then the other way that we have used race, and I put past in quotes because some people still do this, race has been viewed as a proxy or equivalent to things like socioeconomic status, such as educational outcomes or educational attainment, as well as some social determinants of health. That can include things like housing, that can include things like neighborhood, where people will basically make race equivalent to or a proxy for socioeconomic status. But I highlight the current use of race is used to describe how racism leads to differences in health by race. So for this, we need to use critical race theory. This allows us to understand how racism creates and maintains racial inequities in health here in this example, but also how racism creates and maintains racial inequities in our society at large. Any type of racial inequity, you can use critical race theory to understand how racism is the root cause and works to maintain these inequities. And you can use critical race theory as a launching board to develop actions to address racial health inequities. Again, in this case, we're talking about health, but you can also talk about other types of inequities in our society. So I wanted to go a little bit more into critical race theory. It has been formulated in public health by Chandra Ford and colleagues, where they developed the public health critical race praxis, where you look at racism by understanding contemporary patterns of racial relations. This is the concept that racism is ordinary, that that race is a social construct, all of these things, understanding how racism is a part of knowledge production, how it's a part of conceptualization and measurement, and then also they break down action. So here I highlight the four parts of the public health critical race praxis that are related to action, disciplinary self-critique, intersectionality, critical approaches, and a voice. So that is literally giving or allowing the voices of those who experience racism to be heard. Then I also want to highlight the anti-racism praxis from Kame and Griffith in 2018. This has 5 components, but the ones that I want to point out here are socio-political education, structural power analysis, and systems change. And so we argue that community engaged research that has to do with race or racism should involve critical race theory to understand how racism creates and maintains inequities, but also should use anti-racism praxis to understand what to do about racism, not necessarily about race, but we will get to that in a minute. I also want to highlight other critical theories. Most of my work actually is rooted in Black critical theory or Black crit, where we're not necessarily seeking to understand how racism explains or racism creates the realities that we're in, but Black critical theory actually examines Black life in an anti-Black society or in an anti-Black world. So it's not necessarily measuring or studying racism, but it's studying Black experiences and Black life in an anti-Black society. There's also Lat crit, Latino or Latinx critical theory, tribal crit, queer crit, all types of critical theory that you can look into if it applies to your work. But it should be applied to community engaged community engaged research at large. And I'm going to tell you why with these next examples. So this is an example from my work. I'm currently looking at health among Black entrepreneurs. And I'm sorry that this slide has a lot of words on it, but I wanted to make sure I got everything in here. Basically, we have racial differences in entrepreneurship in the US. Not just racial differences, but also ethnic differences between racial groups, or excuse me, within racial groups. And I'll talk about that in a minute. Black studies have found that Black entrepreneurs have better physical and mental health outcomes than those who are employees, but have worse health worse health behaviors. And so to explain that, not just the health impacts or the health among Black entrepreneurs, but also to understand the racial differences in entrepreneurship, we need to take a critical lens and understand that race is a social construct and that we have racial inequities due to racism. So racial differences in entrepreneurship are not due to inherent differences in Black or African Americans compared to other racial and ethnic groups. We can use the case of Black immigrant entrepreneurs as an explanation. Here, the rate among entrepreneurship among Black immigrants, so people who have either immigrated themselves or are the children of or descendants of Black immigrants, actually have pretty high rates of entrepreneurship. But we also know that Black entrepreneurs experience institutional racism when obtaining funding from things like banks and investors. Black entrepreneurs also have less family wealth than their white counterparts due to history and contemporary structural racism. So histories of housing inequities, such as home ownership and how home ownership was restricted and the ways in which it was restricted in the past and contemporarily, leads to large family wealth inequities. And most entrepreneurs, when they are beginning their businesses or their entrepreneurship, they often get that first round of funding from family and friends. But if your family and friends do not have wealth to help you out, then it's not going to happen. And then you have to go and ask for investment from banks and sort of angel investors and those types of things. But Black entrepreneurs actually experience discrimination in obtaining that. So thinking about community engaged work around Black entrepreneurs, we have seen this before. A lot of the health promotion work within Black communities is done, for example, in places like barbershops and salons. Those people are entrepreneurs. So thinking about how to employ Black entrepreneurs in health promotion can be rooted in what has already been done. We also see interventions like specific investment in mentoring programs that specifically target Black entrepreneurs, not just in terms of money, but also in navigating the systems that show up. Then you can also build advocacy through racialized drivers of Black entrepreneurship. Here I'm basing this on work by Bento and Brown in 2020 that finds that Black people who believe in and are knowledgeable about systemic racism are more likely to become entrepreneurs. And I would argue that that's because of understanding that the wealth inequities that we have in our society and thus the inequities in entrepreneurship are due to systemic racism. So we can be using, we can understand race as a social construct to not just understand the inequities, the problems, but also using race as a social construct to shape community engaged work to actually address these problems. Another example that I mentioned before and am bringing up now is community engaged work that is driving potential changes to racial categories in the US Census, and then also community engaged work that is responding to those potential changes. So quick summary, and I'm looking at the time, I actually didn't time this out, so I'm just gonna see what happens. Anyway, they are considering changes to the US Census by adding an additional racial group. First, for Middle Eastern and North Africans, the MENA group or MENA group has been considered as an additional racial group. And then some people are also considering adding some Latino identities as a racial group. So right now, we differentiate ethnicity and race in our, not just the US Census, but most of our governmental data uptaking or data collection, sorry. couldn't think of the right word there, data collection. By first, you identify your ethnicity, whether you are Hispanic or not, Hispanic or Latino or not. And then you identify your racial group. That can be white, Black, Asian, Native American, other, or you can actually pick multiple ones. Now, that was the big change in 2020. But studies have shown that some Latino groups are less likely to put down a specific race. They're more likely to put down other race. And so the idea here is to identify ways in which to more accurately identify those groups. However, some people are arguing that doesn't make sense because, for example, being Mexican or Mexican American is not a race, that's ethnicity to some people. But I would argue that for some people, particularly those Mexican Americans who are wanting to identify Mexican American as their race, that is their race. That's not just their ethnicity. It's not just that I'm Hispanic or Latino, it's that I identify as Mexican American. And so they are socially constructing their Mexican American identity as their race. So this is a great example of how race changes over time and place, that in previous times, people who, for example, might be Mexican American might have identified their race as white, or might have identified it as other, which is more likely the case in that particular group. But because of the ways in which we socially construct race to align with a spectrum of power in our society, where more adjacency to whiteness is associated with more power, but more adjacency to Blackness is associated with less power. We see those changes in this race as a construct over time and over place. We also see this in changes in whiteness over time. A lot of people focus on how Italian Americans, for example, were not considered white until they were over time, but do not often talk about the reasons why that is. That is to increase the number of white people in our society. And that sort of shaping and shifting of who's white and who's not and what's adjacent to whiteness changes over time. Also can talk about racialization specifically among Latinos. One of the main outcries with regard to adding specific Latino ethnicities, or specific Latino identities as racial groups is this concept of the potential erasure of Black Latinos. So if you are a Latino person and you identify as Black, you're able to say under the ethnicity question, I am Latino, but they are also able to say I am Black. But some people are concerned that if you move to having multiple Latino identities quantified or categorized as racial groups, then you will not capture the experience of Black Latinos or the identity of Black Latinos. And this has also been discussed in terms of anti-Blackness in Latinidad, which is not my area of expertise, but it is a concept in which a lot of the definitions or focus of quantifying and measuring and experiencing life or experiencing identity as a Latino person can be shaped by anti-Blackness. So, like I said, these changes actually came from community-based organizations. So organizations that advocate for Middle Eastern and North African identities, or MENA people, or MENA organizations. Also organizations that support various Latino identities. That's community engaged work that led up to these changes. But there's also community engaged work that is affected by these changes and is used or will be used to address these changes. So those are just examples that I wanted to give. And in moving to the next portion of discussion that I wanted to have about, I think where I subtitled it, race is a social construct, yes, but I'm still Black though. I want to make sure that I'm being clear about how we use race as a social construction now in community engaged research First is for understanding racial inequities, and second is for understanding changes in racial categories and identities, those two examples that I gave. But I would argue that if community engaged research, the goal is to dismantle racist systems to eliminate racial inequities, the question would then be to consider, where is race in the future? So if you are identifying and working toward an equitable and just future, the question then follows, what do we do with race in the future? What does it look like? I would, this conceptualization or this vision of the future probably varies for particular people. Some people will want to undo race altogether or get rid of the concept of race altogether, mostly because of the harm that it has created in literally creating a society in which power is differentially allocated based on the racial group that you are put into. But others might argue that race should then shift into ethno-racial identity. So ethnicity is not the same as race. They are not equivalent at all. However, for some people, race can be a part of their identity or inform their identity. You can consider the racialization of immigrants and how that happens, how various ethnicities among people who are immigrants then become racialized once they come to the US, and how that specific identity is now a ethno-racial identity. You can think of people like myself, I don't have any immigrant background other than the enslaved people who were brought here on boats. But my ethnicity is Black, Southern, from North Carolina, right? So those are the things that people are considering shifting race to. However, that is not necessarily how we can understand reality now. And so shaping that future, understanding what we want to occur, is what needs to be done. So again, this sentiment that I hold, race is a social construct, but I'm still Black though, is rooted in the potential erasure of ethnic identity if we are simply saying that race is a social construct without really understanding what's happening and understanding what should happen. The role of ethno-racial identity or ethno-racial assignment, then we can be potentially erasing part of people's identity. And so I use two examples. The first is, if I were to go to a community organization and say race is a social construct, it doesn't matter, they might say, actually, it does matter to us. It's part of who we are, part of what shapes our life, part of what shapes our culture. And so to erase that is unethical. I also use this anecdote when I was in graduate school, sort of probably the first couple of weeks of grad school. I was at Johns Hopkins. Previous to starting grad school, I worked there for 2 years, and so I was very familiar with the neighborhood. Johns Hopkins School of Public Health has 2 buildings where you have to walk maybe a couple of blocks between the buildings. And on those blocks I'm actually not sure if he still is there, but a man who had a hot dog cart, a Black man who had a hot dog cart. And so in my time as a research assistant, not a doctoral student, I would see this man, speak to him, maybe buy a hot dog once a week, and interact with him, myself as a Black woman and him as a Black man. However, during the first couple of weeks of school, I was walking with my classmates, most of which were white people, including very few men, but one white man. And so we were walking down the street going between classes, and I spoke to the hot dog man. I said, "Hey, how are you doing?" And he said, "Hey, how are you doing?" And my classmate sort of, I don't, chastise is too strong of a word, but he wanted to point out a false differentiation. But he said, "Hey, why are you talking to that man? You're not like him. You're like us now. You're in grad school. You're getting an education." I was very young back then, and I did not know how to respond, but I was offended. And that still sticks to me to this day, that, people like to equate race with things like socioeconomic status or have it as a proxy, but it's not. even though I have a PhD, I'm still Black, right? And so that's why I hold that sentiment. Race is a social construct, but I'm still Black though. We're not, I think it's more harmful to try to erase people's racial identity because it can become a part of their ethno-racial identity. So, considering what we can do with this, I argue again that we can do community engaged research that is rooted in Black culture. One of the projects that I'm working on through this Scholar in Residence program is with the Ashe Cultural Arts Center. And it's literally a project on health promotion that is rooted in Black culture. It's all about Black culture. And so you cannot disassociate people from their culture. That is violence. We've seen that multiple times. And it's ineffective. Culture is often a part of people's identity. So I think that because racism is based in anti-Blackness, liberation from racism is rooted in Blackness. And I think that community engaged research must do both. You have to be able to understand race as a social construct in both ways. You have to understand that racism is the root cause of racial inequities, and that you have to acknowledge, respect, and uplift ethno-racial identity. You can't erase people or disregard what they might hold dear, such as ethno-racial identity. And I think that we spend so much time talking about race as a social construct without talking about how it shapes ethno-racial identity. And so to erase that, I think is wrong. And I would argue that people who are doing this type of work, specifically community engaged research that deals with race in whatever form or fashion that it does, must consider their own positionality, must consider the positionality of the people that they're working with, even consider things like epistemology and ontology. If we have to understand race as a social construct, it's critical that we understand our own and the positionality of others. We have to understand epistemology and ontology. You have to understand how your own position can relate to speaking the same language as the people that you're working with. And again, I'm reiterating something that I've said previously, that the solutions to people's problems or communities' problems is already known by those in the community that experience the harm. So it's our job as community engaged researchers to do the work to help bring about those solutions. But lastly, I would close that everyone is not equipped to do this work. I've mentioned that before, but here is the spectrum that I am working on developing, that most community engaged, or the most effective and ethical community engaged research, particularly those or community engaged research that is working with Black populations, is rooted in Black culture towards Black futures. That is kind of complicated. It's a lot if you are not able to understand that or don't know that work. That's totally fine. You can do this type of work that acknowledges ethno-racial identity. But if that's too much for you, you can seek to work to dismantle racist systems. Your community engaged research can do that type of work. But if you think that that's too much, you can do work that acknowledges that race is a social construct. But if that's even too much for you, you might want to do work that does not include community engagement. So I'm closing with that. And I'll stop sharing for the sake of me looking at larger pictures of you all and see if there are any questions, comments, or concerns. Okay, hand claps. Great, thank you. Any questions, comments, or concerns? Can I show the last slide? Yes, I can. And I am, I have a PhD, just like I said. I can pull it up quickly. Let me see if I can go back to it. There we go. All right, that's working. That's working. Okay. Yeah, actually, I can spend a little bit more time talking about the role of Black culture. Yeah, no problem, Amalia. That, again, we in particularly in public health, but I'm sure in other disciplines, I'm thinking of like economics, for example, that we denigrate Black culture, and we have done so in such a way that we blame people for things like eating and smoking and those types of things. But if you are not being racist, then you can engage with Black culture to create the equitable futures that you want. Yes, Claudia, I see your hand up.
Hi. Thank you for your talk today.
Yeah.
I'm pretty new to the whole professional world and everything, and I wanted to attend your talk just to learn a little bit more about racial identities. And I was wondering, I identify as a white female.
Okay.
And I've been, when you touched on, and I'm a finance major, and you touched on like Black entrepreneurship, and I really, like, the next couple of years am interested in, in reading. I took pictures of like all, the sources that you used because I want to read those, but I'm really interested in maybe working for a venture capital firm someday that promotes Black businesses. If you were to give advice to someone with racial identity like mine, engaging in that type of business, what would you say maybe are the do's and don'ts of going into that field, and also, engaging in something that I may not personally identify with?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, listen, I'm not an entrepreneur in my real life. I am in my head. It sounds like a fun thing to do, even though I'm sure it's challenging. But I think that I was literally having this conversation with someone yesterday that first is reading. There's plenty of work on racial inequities in wealth, racial inequities in, there's some work on racial inequities among entrepreneurs. But there's a lot of work on racial inequities in wealth. And if you can think about, the drivers of those wealth inequities, I think that would be a good place to start. But thinking about your explanation for inequities, right? And so when I'm talking to students, I'm often talking about, okay, you see the world happening. What framework are you using to make it make sense, right? So I actually gave the example in class several weeks ago, maybe a month ago. I don't know. Time is a construct as well. About the 5-day COVID sort of was a quarantine rule that the current and they changed it from 10 days to 5 days. So before it was 10 days after you tested positive, you're supposed to quarantine and stay away. They changed it to 5 days, right? And I said the reason for that is the CEOs of Delta and all these big name airplane companies were like, hey, we got to have our workers. We have to make sure that we get these planes in the air. Change it to 5 days. And so people advocated, big, powerful institutions and businesses advocated for that change, that, it makes sense if you understand or have the right framing of the world and what's happening. So for someone like you who is interested in going to venture capital, all of that, you have to make sure that you have the correct framing to understand the world that you're dealing in. So, the idea of, oh, we're not seeing a lot of Black entrepreneurs or Black startup funds. I wonder why that is. Oh my gosh, they're not interested in entrepreneurship. That's not the case. Black entrepreneurs have lots of unique barriers that stop them from being as successful in venture capital. So if you have the correct framework for understanding the world, the realities that you're seeing, that will allow you to make changes and operate in an ethical and moral and just way as someone with your position in racial identity.
Thank you.
No problem. Any other questions or anything that you were like, oh yeah, I hadn't thought about that, or maybe you were like, yeah, everybody knows that. Anything? Okay. Jordan in the chat says, love it. It's more of a don't make assumptions, but ask and be curious. Sure. Yeah, that's critical for everybody. And to understand your place in the spectrum of power related to races is critical as well. Yeah. Yes. Michelle, I don't know how to pronounce your name.
Michelle, it's correct.
Okay.
Yes. I really like that you focus on the healthcare for entrepreneurs, especially African American or minority background. So many times that's just something that's put on the back burner. Healthcare until something drastic happens, and then you're with a pre-existing health condition and you're unable to get covered. So
Yes.
going out and speaking to those small businesses and letting them know there are options for their businesses and for their employees, that's so important and key.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing. I agree. Yeah, again, I'm not an entrepreneur in my real life, but the life of an entrepreneur is very different. So yeah, focusing on their health is important, at least to me.
It is a lot to unpack, definitely. And one big takeaway from me, especially a week ago, our office had a conversation about race and, you know, how we might do away with the concept altogether. And it's such part of the mindset. And I like your reminder that it should not be done at the expense of people's ethno-racial identities, and kind of adding to the dismissal and erasure of something that is such an important part of people's lives and identities.
Yeah, and I think the risk with that though is that, some people's wariness of that is that people will then go back to racial essentialization, where they will not think about people's identity, they will only focus on people's identity rather than focus on the systems and the structures and basically racism. But I think, like I said, you literally have to do both, because I think it's wrong to erase people's identity. It's not, if I wasn't Black, for example, what would I be? That's part of, once you created the system, you're still going to have the impacts of, or the marks of that system, even if you seek to take away the inequities or the injustice of the system. So it's something that we will have to deal with in whatever form. Yeah.
I do have a follow-up question. What would you say, that how is your perspective met in your field, in particular, at an institution of higher education more broadly? And it sounds like there is a lot of theories and practices that have to be undone, that are toxic, detrimental. How is your approach met?
Yeah, that's a important question. Now I was going to say interesting question. It's actually quite basic. So in public health, most of our work is based on the concept of racial disparity. So comparing the health of Black people to the health of white people, right? I argue that it's more important to look at, I argue that it's equally important to look at the health within racial groups, because you cannot compare the experience of whiteness to Blackness. They are not conceptually equivalent. Whiteness is defined by distance from Blackness, but Blackness is defined by the experience of being a Black person in whatever society you're in. And that's sort of putting it simply. So when we constantly compare people, the reason for those inequities is racism. So a lot of work, as it should be, goes into measuring racism, understanding how racism creates these inequities. But I argue that an additional part of the work should be seeking to understand Black experiences, because, for example, when I wake up in the morning, I'm not thinking racism. I'm thinking, I got to get to work, or I got to do this presentation today, or, you know, some of the things that can be shaped by racism. Another part of my research is looking at how family caregiving impacts cardiovascular disease in Black women, particularly, but men also provide caregiving as well. But how that's not necessarily a race-specific thing. It can be shaped by racism. But if I have to get up in the morning and take care of my elderly grandmother, I'm not like, racism. I'm like, I have to make sure she has food. I have to get her to the doctor. I have to make sure she gets to the bath, or whatever it is. So I use a slightly different paradigm. So it's not at the forefront of my field. I think it should be in addition to it, but it's not. And I think that that's okay. I think that you need researchers of all stripes, as long as they're not posing harm, as long as they're all working toward equity and justice.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? If not, we thank you so much for your talk and for your vision and, you know, practice. Thank you so much, Dr. Bell, and thank you all for joining us today.
You.